just to share a little bit about this webinar, we're really, really lucky to have both Parker and Sharon with us together this time. And we're really thrilled about this duo and what they'll be able to share with us today. I also want to say thank you to both of them for having accompanied our community as well over the past few weeks and being present with us and helping all of us be present to one another and everyone around us. Parker, Sharon, thank you so much for joining us one more time. And I think we can dive right in. When you started with us a few weeks ago, we were just beginning in certain parts of the world to go into the tumult. There were things that were still emerging in other parts of the world. And some people were beginning to make their way out. And we're at a different moment where in some places spring is arriving. In other places, people are going back into confinement. And I think for all of us, the reality is that this is a community and a field where we're all holding a lot and holding a lot of people and a lot of communities around the world. So I wanted to just pass it to both of you to share some of your thoughts and reflections with the community in this journey that we're all taking together. So Parker, maybe I could pass it to you to start.
Salzberg, wonderful. Your question about how we negotiate the challenges is of course, has a different response, I think, for different people in different situations. Two things come to my mind that I like to remember because I think they speak to particular struggles, even maybe demons of mine. One comes from my friend Greg Ellison, who stands in a long line of Black liberation activists. And he tells a moving story about a time when he was a kid and he was on his grandmother's front porch in Georgia. And he said, "Grandma, I want to change the world." And she said, "Greg, you can't change the world, but you can change what's within 3 feet or so." And I love that advice. It doesn't make me stop wanting to change the world, but it reminds me in a way that comes from a highly credible person in my experience that I can't meet every need out there, and I need to get that monkey off my back. Because that's often a crushing burden. It's always a crushing burden to carry. But if I can remember Greg's three foot rule, it helps. And little by little, especially sequestered as I've been with my wife since March 1st, finding ways to reach out to whoever's within 3 feet. And then the second wiser than I person that I would refer to is Valerie Carr, who founded the Revolutionary Love Movement. I'm sure many of you know her. K-A-U-R, a Sikh activist and a lawyer and a filmmaker and quite a remarkable human being. And she has 3 tenets in revolutionary love. One is to declare love for all who are in harm's way. The second is to declare love even for our opponents. And the third, to declare love for ourselves. I see that third one as a distinct element in the nonviolent change movement, because Valerie points out that the nonviolent movement of the 60s was male dominated, and it totally neglected self-care among the activists. And she has quite a different slant on it that I value greatly and try to learn from. So 3 feet or so, and take care of yourselves. I guess those would be the words that work for me.
Sharon?
Thank you so much, Parker. It's so lovely to see you and be here with all of you. I think one thing came from people are sending links all the time to articles and things to look at. And somebody sent me a link to an article by someone who's like a specialist in surviving disaster. I didn't know there was quite that specialty exactly, but apparently there is. And what this person wrote was, nobody's going to get an A+ in pandemic crisis survival. It's not going to look perfect. And being able to accept that and somehow get off the repetitive motion of it's got to be perfect. I have to be perfect. I have to do this right. It's just not going to look that way. And part of that for me is accepting poignancy. Even listening to Parker talk about Valerie, whom I spent the month of February in Los Angeles. I live on the East Coast of the US, but I spent between Northern California and Southern California the whole month of February. And I think Valerie may be the last friend I made face to face. She was like the last new person I met. And we went and had lunch together because I'd wanted to meet her. And, so even just hearing about her and brings up this sense of poignancy. It's not grief exactly, over loss, but it's something, it's some flavor that there's a lot of letting go that is happening and a lot of new perhaps being born in all of that letting go. And so I'm very much left with both those things, stop being so critical about not doing it perfectly and accept some of the feelings that are more pervasive that are actually kind of new.
Thanks, Sharon. And I think those are two themes that we'll go into a bit more deeply in this call. So we've been trying to build some of the questions already for today's session from all of the questions that you both received the last time you were on. And so there are two questions that we'd love to start with. One question is, how do we keep staying with our feelings, especially with experiences of stop and go, of some people experiencing shifts of being excited about looking outwards, and then again being put into confinement? With dealing with experiences like a lot of grief around us or even personal loss, and still being so busy that we don't necessarily have the time to process. So how do we stay with all of that?
Sharon, how do we stay with all of that?
I was waiting to see what was going first. Well, I thought it was kind of ironic that you framed it as we're so busy, we don't have time to deal with all of that, which might depict an ordinary day. I'm not sure it should depict what people are going through now, although I myself am very busy. I think it's essential. It's like we have to make time for recognizing our inner world and the relationship of our inner world to external circumstance, and to learn to do that with kindness toward ourselves and compassion toward ourselves is also essential. And I think about, of course, for me, a lot of that is born in my meditation practice. It's almost like a strength training or resilience training that I've done, but it doesn't have to be out of meditation. It's a way of, first of all, understanding we're always beginning again. And that the way we tend to frame things, even in terms of language, belies the truth of constant change. Like, how can I keep this level of peace, or how can I maintain my equanimity throughout this dire circumstance? And usually when people ask me that, in whatever context, how can I keep mindful all the time? How can I stay concentrated? I say, it's not going to happen. It's just not. That's not how life is. There's nothing in life that's a straight shot. We go forward, we fall down, we have to pick ourselves up or let others help us up. We go forward again. Or we have a giant aspiration, a really big dream, and we lose it. We lose sight of it, or circumstances don't easily allow us to make it real. And we have to get back in touch with it and start over again. So I think just remembering that is really crucial. We will go in and out, we'll go up and down, we'll get overwhelmed, we'll come back to balance. That's the nature of things. And the more we can recognize that, the more just we are toward ourselves, and the more I think we can extend that to others. And then actually cultivating the ability, I would actually say, whether you do this in terms of meditation or not, it really doesn't matter, but to be able to distinguish what you're feeling from the story you are telling yourself about that feeling. I should be beyond this. This is going to last forever. I am the only one. I'm holding this in isolation. Because that will give us a clue about whether there might be another way to relate to that feeling, with kindness and with presence. And if we can get there, I found like a lot of insight can be born. Like something we often say, and I say it because it's been my experience, and because I think it is largely true, that if you can sit with your anger and sit with your grief and sit with various painful feelings, which is not easy, but actually hold them in a certain way, very often we see in the heart of those feelings is a sense of helplessness and powerlessness. And if we can get there, then, exactly as Parker said, it's like, okay, what can I do that may seem small or insignificant, but it's enlisting something that is countering that sense of helplessness. Maybe it's 1 feet, 1 foot, around me. I don't know if we can always extend to 3, but that would be a tremendous insight to have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sharon. And just a couple of things that I think are consonant with everything Sharon said. I think the idea of paradox has been a survival tool for me over 81 years. And what I mean by that is that, as Niels Bohr, the physicist, once said, the opposite of an ordinary fact is a lie, but the opposite of one great truth may be another great truth, and you have to hold them simultaneously. That involves holding attention, which is uncomfortable for a lot of us, but it's inevitable with life, I think. And I think the quality of life often hinges on our capacity to hold the great paradoxes. Am I made for community? Absolutely. Would be Zippo without it. Am I made for solitude? Absolutely. We all face a final journey that we can only take alone, and a lot of other times in life as well, as for me during the death in life called depression, where I've visited several times. So I'm thinking about the many paradoxes that I'm experienced right now. For example, I'm energized by wanting to serve and to be a political activist, 2 things I've tried to do in my life. And I'm terminally frustrated by being locked in and not being able to do that stuff hands-on. So to hold the paradox means first to say that tension has something to teach me. That tension is trying to open me to some things that I have yet to learn or that I need to relearn. And one of those probably is, I can't do it all. I have to embrace my current circumstances if I want to do anything. And a second is what Sharon said about feeling I'm not in control. And the truth is, I'm not in control. I never was, even when I thought I was. And I probably did some damage by harboring that illusion. This is a good time to get disillusioned, which when people come to me and say, I'm disillusioned about this or that, I try not to put my hand on their shoulder and commiserate and say, oh, poor thing. I try to say congratulations, because that means you've lost another illusion, and that gets you that much closer to reality. So paradox. The second thing is, I'm really intrigued by how some of the things that are coming to me or that I'm hearing from other people during this uh, challenging period, they remind me of some of the lessons of aging that I've tried to wrestle with very consciously. I'll give you just one that has been a very interesting transformation for me that I think may apply today. About 10 years ago, when I got slightly over, far enough over 70 that I had to confess that that's how old I was. And I started feeling the energy drain that comes with age and the inability to multitask or to hold everything that I'm thinking and that you're thinking all at once without losing a lot of it. I started saying, okay, what do I want to let go of? And what do I want to hang on to, right? That's the conventional framing of the question. But then I did a Quaker Clearness Committee around that issue, which was quite vexing for me. And I came out of that 2-3 hour process with a revised second question. It was no longer, what do I want to let go of and what do I want to hang on to? Hang on to is a clingy, fearful question. Now the question is, what do I want to let go of and what do I want to give myself to? And that's a question that comes from a sense of abundance and generosity, or if it doesn't come exactly from there, it can lead you into a sense of abundance and generosity. And I'm finding that that's a question that really works for me. And my capacity to give varies from time to time, from moment to moment, from situation to situation. And I really work hard not to try to give that which I don't have to give. I think that there are, I mean, one has to speak carefully about this, but there are cases of burnout which don't involve giving too much. They involve giving what one does not have to give, which, you know, begins with 0 and then goes down to minus 1,000. So for me and for a lot of other people who are activists and who want to be caregivers in life, that's an important thing to remember.
Thank you, Parker. Thank you, Sharon. Just a quick comment about everything that's being shared in the chat as well. It's been wonderful to see everyone checking in from all these different parts of the world. And so this massive kaleidoscope of all of us as humans. And also thank you to all the people that are sharing echoes or different thoughts, and just to open up space as well for questions that people might have as we go along. So I have a follow-up question from what we've seen shared as a question for both of you before. And I was originally going to formulate the question, Sharon, as how do we stay with our vulnerability? I'm going to reformulate the question now as how do we come back to our vulnerability?
Thank you.
And I hope that's a better formulation. And so maybe we can start with you with that question.
Well, for me, the word vulnerability has been very aligned with truth-telling or being honest. I've seen, for example, in communications trainings between people, how somebody might start with a statement like, you never show up for anybody. And through a process of reframing and using I language and all of that, they come to a place of saying, I had so hoped you would be my friend. And when you walked on by ignoring me, my heart just sank. And that was the truth. And difficult to get to, difficult to say. And you don't necessarily want to be that way in every context with every relationship. But I think we should at least know that this is what is actually going on. And the closer we get to the truth, I think the more empowered we are. That's why the irony of vulnerability, which seems so weak, or, you know, that's going to make me ineffectual. I'm not going to be able to lead. I think it's actually the honesty of it is what is compelling. And I think that's what makes us strong. And we return to it because I think it's helpful to always just pay attention. What does it feel like to have a persona, you know, that is impeccable and swaggering and in charge of everything, when really inside, you're feeling, I don't know what to do. I need to pause. I need to just wait. I need to see what arises. And I was very taken with what Parker just said, because burnout is rampant. It's been rampant for a very long time, in especially in populations, people who are working very directly with the suffering of others. It's a tremendous issue, often unaddressed and unacknowledged, but it's a tremendous issue. And it doesn't come from what so much of the world can suffer from, which is a lack of empathy at all. It really comes from other things, not having maybe a great sense of boundaries, or having undue expectations about ourselves, or not being able to return to that sense of vulnerability and feeling like it's weak or wrong. Whereas really, I think it can be one of our greatest strengths.
Thank you, Sharon. Parker?
Well, I want to thank Sharon too. Whenever I hear Sharon speak about these things, I start thinking fruitfully, and I want the next day or two to keep thinking rather than having to say anything. So thank you very much. Yeah, I think what Sharon just said is very much related to what I was trying to say with this idea that disillusionment is a good thing. You've lost illusions. On the specific question of vulnerability, two things come to me. One is that vulnerability is a form of courage in itself. If it involves embracing the truth about oneself, one's relationships, one's work, one's world, that takes courage. I know this in part from my journeys with depression, which in my case had a lot to do with not embracing the truth about myself, with getting, with losing my own North Star vocationally, for example. The other thing, so courage and vulnerability, I don't hold them as a paradox. I hold vulnerability as a form of courage. The other thing I want to say is that when one is feeling, at least I would say this about myself, I really don't know what it's like for other people, of course. But when I'm feeling like I've lost my vulnerability, like I can no longer find that place from which I can reach out to the world and receive the world, I'm inclined to think it's not usually because I've shut the doors, but because I've let in more than I can handle. Vulnerability can be killed off by certain kinds of life experiences. That one distinction I've always liked to make is that life is heartbreaking, but there are two ways for the heart to break. It can break apart into a million shards, and sometimes in that explosion be thrown like a fragment grenade at the ostensible source of one's pain. There's a lot of that going around. But the heart can also be broken in a way that gives it greater capacity to hold one's own and the world's suffering and joy. I think a lot depends on our willingness to exercise our hearts over a lifetime, because it's the supple heart that doesn't, snap, just like it's the supple muscle that doesn't snap when an athlete is doing his or her thing. So exercise by taking in the little deaths and disappointments and losses. I see a lot of older people suffering great losses and thinking their lives are over, and taking a long time underground to eventually come up to the surface with larger hearts, with a new sense that not in spite of their loss, the loss of a loved one, for example, not in spite of that loss, but because of that loss, they've become bigger people, more accepting people, more loving people, more generous people. So I don't think this is some, I'm sorry, I spent the 60s in Berkeley, so I just have to say this. I didn't think that up in a hot tub in Northern California. I think it's a life experience that a lot of people have. So, maybe thinking about the way in which a sense that I've lost my vulnerability is actually needs to be reframed as I've taken in more than I can hold, and what can I learn from that?
Thank you, Parker. So I'm just going to get, Sharon, did you want to jump back in? Oh, okay. I'm just going to pass it to Sharon with a little bit of framing. So this is building on this piece about taking on too much or finding ourselves overwhelmed. One of the things that we're seeing for a lot of our community is that we're being asked to do a lot. We're trying to do a lot. And sometimes we can push ourselves, hearing our own voice or voices within us saying that we need to do more, that we're not doing enough, that there is much more that needs to be responded to. So in holding those critical voices as well within ourselves, Sharon is going to lead us in a tiny bit of an exercise around that. And Sharon, I'll pass it to you both for framing and more.
Thank you. Well, I know that problem quite a lot. A friend wrote to me, I had written something and he wrote back like in all caps, saying no more, just say no. Is very difficult because one genuinely feels the need. So I usually start myself with going back to what is really my North Star, like what's my deepest aspiration for this life? How do I want to be? What difference do I want to make? And then what I usually find is that I need to make that aspiration bigger. It's not that I need to shrink it in response to circumstance, but it probably is already too specific or too limited in the sense of, for example, maybe I want to be able to teach a certain number of people, reach a certain number of people with my work, which could leave me endlessly frustrating. And maybe the bigger picture of that is I want to make a difference, right? And that's not a calculation like 4 people isn't enough, or 3 feet isn't enough. That's sort of the actual opening. And then I do what I can. And always, we have to include ourselves in that assessment. We will just burn out. We will not be able to accomplish every specific goal. And if we hold it too rigidly, then it becomes perfectionism. So usually I do start with just thinking of my aspiration, my kind of life aspiration, not just to, get better food for next week or something, but really what is the biggest holding I can have. And then recognize that the particular manifestation, the way that's going to come to life, it may not be grandiose. It's not going to be magnificent all the time. It's what I see in front of me can be done. And how does that translate? So that's the start. And then there's an exercise that we do where if you have a persistent, critical, nasty, harsh voice that is just bringing you down, see if you can give it a name, give it a persona, maybe give it a wardrobe, because everything is going to depend on how you relate to that voice. It's not trying to abolish it, and it's not feeling you're wrong for having it. It's also not just letting it take over, but how are you going to relate to it? And can there be a kind of awareness, like my presence, my comprehension, my connection to others, my connection to a bigger picture is stronger than that voice. That voice is a visitor. And we can be gracious, we can be kind, we can be present. Don't let it take over. But don't freak out at the appearance. So I usually go on to say that I named my own inner critic Lucy after, with apologies to any Lucys that are listening, after the character in the Peanuts comic strip, because I once saw a cartoon where two of the main characters in that comic strip are Lucy and then Charlie Brown, who she often brings a lot of suffering and turmoil to. So Lucy says to Charlie Brown, do you know what your problem is? The problem with you is that you're you. And then poor Charlie Brown says, well, what in the world can I do about that? And Lucy says, I don't pretend to be able to give advice. I merely point out the problem. And interestingly enough, right after I saw the cartoon, something happened in my life. Something great happened, really wonderful. And my very first thought was, that's never going to happen again. And I greeted that thought with, hi, Lucy. Chill out, Lucy. Which is different than, you're right, Lucy. You're always right. I'm worthless. I can't do anything. I can never do enough. And it's also different than, I can't believe I've been meditating all these years and Lucy's still here, and all that money in therapy and Lucy's still here. And, you know, I'm such a terrible failure. Why is Lucy still here? Right? So to recognize that very critical voice for what it is, as a habit, maybe it's someone else's voice that we've absorbed, and to have that kind of presence to be there, remember what we really care about, that's the aspiration, and let Lucy, you know, have a cup of tea in the corner. That's okay. We're strong enough for that. So we can actually do that in the form of a reflection and meditation together. So I'll take a few minutes just to guide that. If you want to sit comfortably, close your eyes or not, however you feel most at ease. You can start just by resting your attention on something like the feeling of the breath, something in your body that's already happening, just as a way of gathering attention and energy, coming more to the present moment. And you can actually have that reflection, like, what is your deepest, strongest, most abiding aspiration? And if something arises and you take a look at it, maybe you think, how can I extend this? How can I make it bigger? How can I make it so not limited to certain circumstance, success in the eyes of the world, or a certain position? And then bring your attention back to the feeling of the breath or the body. And let that be like the home base. If you recollect a very critical voice, what do you usually say to yourself when you feel you haven't measured up or things haven't gone quite right? And how unfair is that voice, or belittling, or excessively demanding? That's not a voice of justice, actually. That's a very unfair voice. And if you find one, give it a name. Give it a persona. And you don't have to try to destroy it, but invite it to sit down, take a break, have a cup of tea. See what that feels like. See if you can settle your attention on the feeling of the breath or the sensation in the body that you've chosen. And just rest. Then notice how you speak to yourself when your attention wanders, when you get lost in the past or lost in the future, judgment, speculation, or you fall asleep. That's the moment where we can let Lucy take a break and be kinder to ourselves. And remember that beginning again is the key. Being able to let go, being able to start over. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze, and we'll end the meditation.
Sharon, thank you.
Thank you.
And so maybe a first follow-up question to this. Sometimes we can find it hard to ask for support, and this voice can play a role. How do we ask for support? Parker, you look, yeah, there we go.
Did you just unmute me? I'll have to tell my wife. She's been looking for ways to mute me for a long time. I want to thank Sharon for the meditation, which was very helpful to me. And Sharon, we'll have to have a sidebar at some point about, I didn't know about your Lucy thing. I'm Charlie Brown to your Lucy. So we can talk about that at another time. I think you asked for support by saying help to somebody who you have reason to believe might respond. And what I, of course, mean by that is that one of the things one learns over time from finding oneself at the end of one's rope or lacking in the gift or the capacity to respond to a person or people in need is the importance of being embedded in a community. I mention that because that's what the Wellness Project is all about. It's providing communal support for a lot of people, and I'm sure that you call on each other in ways other than a webinar like this. I'm very lucky in my work life to have developed a community of maybe 300 people around the country through the Center for Courage and Renewal. And I find myself calling on them for this kind of help or that as time goes on. And when I'm having a day where, like today, I'm going to be online with several webinars or podcasts, and a friend texts me this morning and tells me that a dear cousin just died of COVID-19 because she and her community weren't of a mind to follow the stay home and wear masks and gloves type. I wanted desperately to, hold her psychologically and spiritually in this very difficult moment. I told her why that wasn't possible today, and we both talked for a while and came up with a member of that community, which she too is part of, who could be helpful at this time, because in her grief, she wasn't in a position to scan the horizon and remember who all might be out there. So in my life, there was a long, long period when, as with most people who look like me and are programmed like me, help was ridiculous. The idea that I would need help was ridiculous. I thought that proving myself as a man or establishing myself in a career meant that I would never need any help if I were good at what I were doing. Reaching out for help was not something I was prepared to do. Then along come some life experiences like clinical depression that hit you with the cosmic 2x4, and you realize that asking for help is a survival tool. And as time went on, I deepened that notion into something that I don't hear talked about enough, I think. And that is that if you want to help other people at the level that a lot of us want to help other people, you can't do that if you're unable to receive that kind of help for yourself. I mean, the very simple equation is you can't give what you're unwilling to receive. I think that just holds true. If you're dealing with physical stuff and you don't want a house filled with refrigerators, you can still sell refrigerators. But at the level of life where we're working, I don't think you can give what you can't receive. So that has provided a powerful motivation for me to be more vulnerable about my need for hope, for help and hope. And is one of the reasons I regard vulnerability as a form of courage.
There's a follow-up question to the vulnerability piece in the chat, which is about what happens when other people see our vulnerability.
I think there's a kind of transparency that happens that is welcoming. You want to be judicious about what you express to whom, but I think what Parker just said is completely true. That um, I think there's a level of trust that arises because it is so honest. Um, and you may not want to express your total vulnerability in every context, but I think there's a kind of integrity to that which is appealing. Like I was thinking in terms of what you just asked, about how do you accept help or how do you ask for help. um, I actually thought of Ram Dass, who was an iconic figure in the 60s and 70s, and a very old friend of mine. I met him at my very first meditation retreat in 1971 in India, and we were friends ever since. And um, we were co-teaching a retreat on Maui because toward the end of his life he moved to Maui and he didn't leave. So on Hawaii, so we were there, and by then he had had a very severe stroke and he was living in a wheelchair, and his speech was quite impeded, um, and yet he was teaching. And it was always so interesting because he uh, prior to his stroke had been, I think, the most articulate person I knew, and his ability to express something was really unparalleled. And then it was different, and yet he was out there. He wasn't hiding. He was offering what he could offer, and it was quite a lot. And so one day he was teaching, and he said that the hardest thing of all about the stroke, harder than living in a wheelchair, harder than the physical pain, harder than the aphasia, the difficulty with his speech, was having to receive help. And I think that is very true, having known him for so long. And uh, I'd seen it over and over and over again. And he was a helper. He was the kind of person who gave, he didn't receive very easily. And he said the hardest thing of all was being able to receive help. And it was the most liberating. And um, I think it's like a practice. It doesn't come naturally or automatically for many of us. We're givers, or we try to make a difference for others. And it feels creepy, to think of somebody offering something to us. But what happened for Ram Dass was, I think, a real emblem. What he said at the end of that talk was, one of his famous books was called How Can I Help? And he said, now I feel like writing a book called How Can You Help Me? And I saw what happened for him really was like a transparency. There was no barrier to the generosity. It could come in, it could flow out. And I realized that before there was some impediment. He was giving and he was offering, but because he couldn't receive in the same way, there was like almost like a blockage in some strange way. Even though his offering was tremendous. And still later in life, when there was that almost like mutuality or that sense of flow, he was just like pure love. It was different, and that came not from giving more; it came from being able to receive.
Thank you, Sharon.
Aaron, if I could respond briefly to that with gratitude for everything Sharon just said, and I think building on it. I think most of us have had the experience of becoming vulnerable in not just with a highly trusted friend, but maybe in a public way. I had that experience when I started speaking and writing about my deep dives into clinical depression. Incidentally, it took me 10 years after the first depression to feel that experience of profound darkness was well enough integrated into my sense of self that I could freely and openly say, I am all of the above. I am my gifts and the deep pits I've fallen into. That sense that, wholeness does not mean perfection, but it means integrating your brokenness into your sense of who you are. That's wholeness. So when I started writing about my depression and the devastation of it, I got a lot of counsel from colleagues who said, Parker, you're just, you know, signing a death warrant professionally, because people are going to see you as weak, and people are going to, you know, this and that. What I knew inside of me was that it was therapeutic for me to show up in the world as who I really was. I was tired of hiding out. And frankly, at my age, I can't think of a sadder way to die. I can think of painful ways to die, but I can't think of a sadder way to die than realizing that I spent 80 plus or whatever number of years on the face of the earth without showing up as me. What a waste of time. What a waste of a life. And remember, I was part of a generation that was highly impacted by a public event where Thomas Eagleton, who was the running mate of George McGovern for president of the United States, it was discovered that he had been treated in a mental hospital for depression. And McGovern dropped him like a hot potato, because that just wouldn't do in a vice president of the United States. And so, you know, that for a lot of white men my age, that was a cautionary tale. Long story short, I've written 10 books, or I've written the same book 10 times probably. And of all the things I've written about, education and democracy and spirituality, the overwhelming preponderance of response I get to this stuff is a chapter I wrote in a book called Let Your Life Speak about my depression, because it's connective tissue with other people. We don't connect through our glory and grandeur and success. We connect in the broken places, as Leonard Cohen told us. It's where the light gets in. So I totally agree with Sharon. You have to be judicious. And on the other hand, there are times when a public witness becomes a sort of the soul's imperative, because so many people are suffering from the same thing, and they need to know it's okay. That's part of being human.
Thank you, Parker. Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to try and shoehorn one last question in. In a way, this maybe sets the stage for having you guys reflect on this longer with us at another date, but at least this will be a start to this. One of the questions that also came up is, how do we bridge with others? And that question is especially important right now because so many of us are carrying important social change agendas that have to do with climate change, water, migration, and so many other things, and hoping for a very different world. And yet the reality also is that many, many people around the world are going to struggle for a long time economically because of what's happening. And so how do we reach out to everyone in the social change that we do or that we're undertaking? How do we speak with a voice that embraces everyone? You guys are deciding by smile, which is awesome.
Or pointing.
Yeah. Oh, Parker.
Sharon, did you want me
Sure.
to go?
I mean, I don't know that I have an answer to that. I have a response, which is actually, I think, just a reframing of what Parker just said, that if we, in a way, bear witness to our own experience and express it, that's very different and much more inclusive a message, ironically, since we're speaking about ourselves, than a more didactic message. So, for example, I'm getting a lot of emails from friends saying, the devastation we are facing now is just dress rehearsal for climate change. And I find that terrifying, in a way. And I don't know what to do with it. And I think if somebody just framed that like, I am really afraid that the devastation we are facing now is just a dress rehearsal for climate change. I feel like a human to human interaction, and I start thinking more deeply, and I feel for that level of panic, but it's not because I suddenly, am kind of overcome by an abstract notion. And so I often come back to that, like, what can I express as me? How can I put that forward in a way that doesn't deny, the gravity or the intensity of everything, but somehow keeps it as a human to human connection.
Thank you, Sharon. And
Well,
Parker,
Aaron, yeah,
we're at the magic
yeah.
moment of the hour, unfortunately.
Can I just say a quick thing?
Go for it.
I want to hold the other pole of the paradox and say I don't think it's possible to speak to everybody.
Oh, that's
And
true too.
I don't think you have to speak to everybody to get the job done. If you can get 50%, 51% of the people to understand an issue more deeply, I personally don't think you should waste your energy trying to speak to everybody, because not everybody wants to listen. And it's a hard reality of politics, but it grieves me a bit. It grieves me a lot, actually, when I see people reaching for the farthest extremes of those who don't want to listen and then declaring themselves a failure because they weren't heard. That seems silly.
Parker, going back to the beginning of this call, you've managed to channel your political activist without going outside. So thank you.
I agree. I almost said the same thing. Don't try to reach everybody.
That's a first.
So just to bring us to a close, one quick thing. Our webinar next week is going to be with Chung Liang, a wonderful Tai Chi master. And the idea is dropping into our body in this experience. And so it should be a very different experience than the kind of webinars we've done over the past few weeks, and a very beautiful experience as well. And we're looking forward to having you all with us for that. Sharon, Parker, thank you both for having joined us. And to bring us to a close, Sharon is going to lead us in a closing, and a closing that's a blessing. And if you want, you can take a moment to linger for a moment afterwards, just to take in the experience of the past hour and also the beautiful and broad community that's together with us. Sharon, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. I just want to, I will repeat, and if you like, you can silently repeat the phrases of loving kindness meditation, which are a blessing. And they are about all beings, but I want to request that you make sure you include yourself in that sphere of all beings, okay? And if you want to change the word, something is more meaningful for you, that of course is totally fine. So may all beings be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with peace. Thank you.